Verse 12, he says, but a stupid man will get understanding when a wild donkey's colt is born a man. Now, there are probably anywhere from 3,000 to 3,500 years that separate us from the setting of this story. So some of these phrases can get lost in translation and difficult to understand. Elmer Smick, who is a professor at Gordon Conwell for a long, long time here in Massachusetts, basically puts it in a way that's easy for us to understand. He says this, Job, this is what Zophar is saying about Job. Job is a witless, empty-headed man with as much chance to become wise as a wild donkey has to be born tame. How'd you like your friend saying that to you in the middle of your distress and despair? And finally, the fourth thing he accuses Job of being is bullheaded, ungovernable, unteachable. And he thinks if Job just got the simple message, if he understood this retribution principle, he could get his life back. This is a picture of a simplistic theology. Verses 13 through 19, he says this of chapter 11, if you prepare your heart, you will stretch out your hand toward him. If iniquity is in your hand, put it far away, and let not injustice dwell in your hearts. Surely when you lift up your face without blemish, you will be secure and will not fear. You will forget your misery, and you will remember it as waters that have passed away. And your life will be brighter than the noonday. Its darkness will be like the morning, and you will feel secure because there is hope, and you will look around and take your rest in security. You will lie down, and none will make you afraid. Many will court your favor. Job, just admit it. Like he's been challenging them. Tell me what my sin is so I can deal with it. They haven't been able to put their finger on it. And he's basically saying to Job, Job, you have some awful, evil, secret sin in your life, and what you need to do is you need to turn away from it, repent from that sin, confess it, and then all of your problems are going to go away, Job. All of them. And well, we know that that's not the case in Job's situation at all. We know that Job is going through this not because God is angry at him, but because he is the apple of God's eye. God is putting Job on display to glorify himself. God is not punishing Job in this particular situation. But Zophar is so, at this point, he is so done with Job that he thinks that it's impossible for him to do this. He says in verse 20, he says, but the eyes of the wicked will fail, all way of escape will be lost to them, and their hope is to breathe their last. Remember, Job is just, he wants to breathe his last. He's already been saying this, and so he's saying, look, the wicked person like you, Job, you're like a blind person in a terrible cataclysmic event. You can't find your way out. You can't come to this. You are beyond this, Job. And so this is kind of the way he ends his speech to Job. Well, he wants to straighten Job out. Well, by Job. He says in verse 2, and I think it's really good that Job says this, and it's good to be reminded, we as people, we need to have boundaries, healthy boundaries. And Job, even in the midst of his despair, has healthy boundaries. He says, what you know, I also know. I am not inferior to you. That's how he begins in that section anyway. What Job wants really is a trial. He wants a trial. He says in verse 3 of chapter 13, but I would speak to the Almighty, and I would desire to argue my case with God. Okay, let's look at that triangle again, if we could show it one more time. Job never claims that he's sinless, but he does claim to be blameless. And we know from the back of the story that the Lord says the same thing, that really the things that happen to Job have not fallen on him for anything that he's done. So Job believes that he is righteous. But Job is confused. And so what he's calling into question is God's justice. And so what Job is asking to do is to sue God. He wants to take God to court. He wants to sue him. Now, looking at this triangle again, which of the three sides are wrong? It's the retribution principle. That's the piece that's incorrect. God's justice is intact. Job's righteousness is intact. But from behind the scenes, the piece that doesn't work is that retribution principle. It's just that Job doesn't know that. And so Job wants to go to court, and he's been saying this now for a little bit. And one of the things that he wants his friends to understand is that God isn't as simplistic as they think he is. And that's one of the dangerous things about trying to put God in a box. Sometimes we try to control God, we try to think about him, and we try to put him in our own terms. It's sort of like, have you ever had a conversation with somebody and they say about God, well, I won't believe a God like that. I won't believe, you read from the Bible, I won't believe in a God like that. Well, whether we believe in him in a certain way or not doesn't change the fact that he is who he is. It reminds me of a theologian who said that he spent his whole career and he felt as if he was like a scientist looking through a microscope, and God was in the microscope and he was looking at God through the microscope. And then one day it dawned on him that God's the one looking through the microscope and he's the one under scrutiny. And everything was reversed. And sometimes we speak about God and we think about God in terms like we can control him, and that God should do the things in the way that we want him to. And that was the fundamental mistake, was that they didn't recognize that God's ways are inscrutable. They're beyond our understanding. God sees the end from the beginning. And so he gives them some examples. He says, then, if you believe this, if you believe that I'm being treated fairly, then tell me why this. Why is it? And let's look at, Job chapter 12:6. It says, the tents of robbers are at peace, and those who provoke God are secure, who bring their God in their hand. How can you explain then that if this is all working out the way that you want it to, and by the way, Job still believes in this retribution principle, and he says, well, how can it be that robbers are at peace and those who provoke God are secure? They've all seen it. How can you deny that that's true? And Job is beginning to think that maybe God isn't being fair. We notice here, and he continues on in chapter 12, 17 through 25, he says this, he leads counselors away stripped, and judges he makes fools. He looses the bonds of kings and binds a waistcloth on their hips. He leads priests away stripped and overthrows the mighty. He deprives speech of those who are trusted and takes away the discernment of the elders. He pours contempt on princes and loosens the belt of the strong. He uncovers the deep out of the darkness and brings deep darkness to light. He makes nations great and he destroys them. He enlarges nations. He leads them away. He takes away understanding from their chiefs of the people of the earth and makes them wander in a trackless waste. They grope in the dark without light, and he makes them stagger like a drunken man. What is he saying? Saying, well, you think about the world in which we live. What does a person do? What does a typical person do? They go out and they build their life. Maybe you have a business, and you start out and you build your business, and at first it's difficult, and you're not quite sure if you're going to make it, and then you make it a little bit further, and you make it a little bit further, and you build it, and you build it, and you make it stronger and stronger, and over time you just keep building it and making it stronger. Maybe you work in an organization. And maybe you've been contributing to that organization, and you help build that organization, and you do your best in that organization. Or maybe it's some other domain that you're part of, or a farmer who goes and builds a farm. He tries to, every year, he tries to make that farm a little bit better, a little bit better. But what he says about God, it's different. God is different. He'll raise up a nation, and then he'll tear it down. God will give counselors wisdom, and then he'll make them fools. God will put a person on a throne. He'll be king, and then he makes him a slave. It says God's ways are just not so easy to understand. We can't just simplify all of his ways in the way that you're describing it. His friends were describing it. And so Job is perplexed at all of these things. But it's interesting that Job still has hope. He has hope. And part of that is he believes that God will hear his case. First hope is this: whether it's in this life or in the next, God will hear him. Chapter 13, verse 15, he says, though he slay me, I will hope in him. Yet I will argue my ways to his face. Why does Job say that? Because Job had a relationship with God. Job knew God all of his life. He knew that God was a good God. He knew that God was faithful. Even though he thought he was being treated unfairly, even though he began to doubt God's justice, he knew at the end of the day that God would be faithful, that it would either be in this life or in the next, God would hear him and God would give him a trial. He was confident in that. In my case, I know that I shall be in the right. Who is there who will contend with me? For then I would be silent and die. What is he saying? He's saying that not only will God give him his opportunity to speak, but he believes that through it he'll be reconciled with God. He believes in his heart that he'll be reconciled with God. Now, Job doesn't realize that he's not reconciled with God. Because Job has bought into some of the cultural ideas around him about this retribution principle, he's bought into this notion that somehow he's being punished for something, somehow God isn't happy with him. He has no idea that he's the apple of God's eye, that God is putting him on display before the whole cosmos to shine forth his glory. He has no idea of any of those things. He's just assuming that God must be mad at him and that the reconciliation needs to take place. But the beautiful thing in all of this is that he's confident that one way or the other, this reconciliation will happen. When he says that I know that I will be in the right, he doesn't mean by that God will be wrong. No, what he's saying is that God will bring him and himself together, and that the relationship will now be repaired and restored. And so that's where Job's hope finds itself, and it's because of the experiences that he's had with the Lord throughout the course of his life. He knows this God. He knows how good God is. And so in the midst of everything else, when he's lost everything else, he has one hope, and that is God, and that is more than enough. He never asked for his possessions back. He never asked for his servants back. He never asked for his children back. He never asked for his marriage to be fixed. He never asked for anything else. All he wants is to be restored in his relationship with God, because that's what matters to him in his life the most. And so we see this picture of him desiring this reconciliation with God, even though he doesn't know that he already is. Well, what are some applications that we can take from this together as we've read it? Number one, when we're dealing with a broken person, we need to take great care not to crush them. When we're dealing with a broken person, we need to take great care not to crush them. Zophar believed in the one-step rule for counseling. You know what that is? Snap out of it. Have you ever used that method? He is a practitioner of that method. But that's not what Job needed. In fact, he calls Job a blubbering, bullheaded, stupid piece of trash. That's how he deals with Job and his pain. Well, we've all seen situations like this where a younger man, he comes into maybe wealth easily or something like this, and begins to look at older men who maybe aren't as successful as he is, and he begins to make judgments about those older men. These are things that commonly happen when things come too easily, too quickly. And for Zophar, that was certainly a story of his life. He thought he was in right stead with God because he had everything that was necessary and everything that was important in his life, and Job didn't. Job, he reflects on this in 13:4. He says that they are whitewashed with lies, and he calls them in verse 5, he calls them, I believe in verse 5, let me just double check that. 13, and he calls them in verse 4, worthless physicians. Verse 4, worthless physicians. So in the middle of it, he gives them a warning. He says they're doing the right thing, but they're doing it in the wrong way. They're doing it in the wrong way. This is, Lord him, will you plead the case for God? Will it be well with you when he searches you out? Or can you deceive him as one deceives a man? He will surely rebuke you if in secret you show partiality. Will not his majesty terrify you and the dread of him fall upon you? You see, Job is doing something kind for his friends. He is actually warning them. They have put God in a box, and now they're speaking falsely of God. Something we talked about last time. When we are